Hey again, everyone. So Julia, thank you so much for doing a presentation for us on ecofeminism. Um, I find that the readings that I gave you can be a little bit confusing. It's hard to find really good kind of introductory readings about ecofeminist theory because it is one of the more theoretical, I don't know how else to explain this, um, kinds of literary theories that we use to interpret texts. It's also my theory of choice. So I hope I'm not stepping on your toes, Julia. Everybody, please do make sure that you go and look at her presentation. But I also want to make sure that ecofeminist theory is clear to you guys so that you can use it as a lens to interpret our texts if you would like to. So we know that this term was, oh boy, this is a French name, and I'm reading off my little notes here. This term was coined by Francois de Aubin, French, in 1974, and essentially what ecofeminism is in its first iteration and at its core is it says that there is an opposition, right? That men are associated with culture, with rationality, with reason, right? That they are put on kind of a higher pedestal. And seen as the opposite are women, right? And that they are associated more with nature and nurturing images. We've kind of talked about this in the past whenever we discussed gender roles. So usually we have men and culture, and then we kind of have a versus women and nature. This is a kind of logic of domination and a master model, right, in which men in culture are upheld, women in nature are kind of put down here lower. And this allows for exploitation of women and the natural world. A good example of this is whenever Europeans first started coming to the Americas, specifically the United States, which they dubbed the New World. So whenever the French, the Spanish, the British were starting to come over to the Americas and they began their colonization efforts, the natural world in the United States at that time, I mean, it didn't look anything like it does today. It was essentially untouched. This isn't entirely true because native peoples have been living in the Americas for thousands of years, but it certainly didn't have the kind of industrialization or buildings and cities that places in Europe had. And so whenever colonizers were coming over, they were like, oh, gasp! It's beautiful! This is a brand new paradise! This must be heaven on earth! In fact, this must be just like the Garden of Eden, right? So that was the kind of way that they interacted with the natural world. And the natural world was often feminized too, seen as fecund and fruitful and just waiting for these explorers to come in. It was going to give up all its fruitfulness to them. It was going to take care of them. So you can see how the natural world is feminized to allow it to be exploited, right? There's multiple different examples of this, especially throughout Western culture, but this is a really big one that might read true for all of us as Americans today. Okay, and so ecofeminism kind of notes this alignment between women and nature, this kind of traditional alignment, and says instead of denigrating women in nature, can we instead uphold them? Can we reverse? Can we remove men in culture from up here and instead put women in nature up here? Or can we at least put them on a kind of even playing field? Now, as some of our readings make clear, the problem with this is that it kind of rings of essentialism. It says that men are one way, right, and women are another way, and that culture is this way, and that nature is this way, and we know that men are not necessarily one way, and that women are not necessarily another way, right? So there was this problem of how do you get around this inherent connection, right, between women and nature. So that's often been a kind of model for how Westerners have related to the natural world. But the connection between women and nature isn't inherent, right? That's just a cultural notion, and cultural notions aren't always true. So what a lot of scholars came out and said was, well, actually, instead, we can see humans and nature as existing on a continuum, and we can see men and women and individuals of all genders as existing on a kind of continuum with nature. The person who really coined this is Val Plumwood in her, I can't remember whether it's 1993 or 1994 text, Feminism and the Mastery of Nature, which is one of my favorite scholarly texts. It's like really good, scary good. And she posits this idea of continuity where instead of seeing ourselves as separate from nature, which humans usually like to do, we like to sit in our houses and think, this is the man-made world, this is all man-built, and then out there is the natural world. That's not entirely true. We're never fully separated from the natural world, right? And this is because humans are living, natural, organic beings to some extent. And your body is always to some degree interacting with the natural world, right? So right now, in all of us, there's bacteria moving around through our guts. That's a kind of image of nature, just on a smaller scale. So there really is no clear separation between, Val Plumwood at least says, between humans and nature. Instead, it's just like degrees of continuity. Think of that spectrum of gender. You can think of that degree of continuity as well. I also want to point you to another scholar. This scholar is not brought up in our reading. Her name is Stacey Alamo. I really love her. I got to see her talk once. She's brilliant. A very strange lady, but very brilliant. And she talks about in Bodily Natures, her book Bodily Natures, which was published in 2010 and is another one of my favorites. It's very weird, but so good. She talks about, instead of connectivity or continuity, she talks about this idea of transcorporeality, which is really fascinating. And that is the idea that the human body is never hermetically sealed. It's always in constant dialogue and exchange with the natural world. A really good example of this that she provides is one of radiation. That radiation, if you go near a site that has radiation, that doesn't stay outside of your body. It transcorporeally flows into your body and changes your insides, right? So the human cannot be separated from the natural world. You could also think about it this way. Maybe your grandparents have a garden, or maybe you've had a garden, or someone you know has had a garden, or whenever you were in elementary school, you were made to grow a tomato plant like I was. Whenever you do that, you kind of have this really intimate connection with the growing process. You put the seed in the ground, the plant grows, you pull off the tomato, you eat it. The natural world actually becomes a part of you. It traverses the boundaries of the body, and eventually that tomato is going to reappear just in your body's digested waste form, right? So there's no separation really between humans and the natural world all that much. We just like to think of human exceptionalism, that humans are at the top, that we are this special thing, and so that makes us non-natural. Humans are actually pretty natural creatures. I mean, think about your own similarities to your cat or your dog. They all have emotions, right? They all grow hair too. They need to eat. They need to expel waste. We're not necessarily, at least ecofeminism posits, humans are not as unique as we tend to think we are. We've never really been separated from the natural world. We just needed to come up with that kind of societal notion in order to justify our exploitation of nature. And I also want to note that a lot of ecofeminist work, especially modern ecofeminist work, is focused on ideas of environmental justice. So, for example, even if scholars are doing kind of an ecofeminist reading of Shakespeare or something from the medieval period or something written in China or something written, by an African author, or something written in the early, periods of U.S. literature. What a lot of scholars tend to do nowadays is to say, here's the lessons that we can learn about nature from those texts, and here's how we can apply it to our own modern moment to be more ethical in the way that we relate to nature. This has been really fueled in particular by natural disasters, such as Katrina, whenever that hit in, when was that, 2005 or 2006? And also by the growing awareness of climate change. So a lot of ecofeminist scholars, myself included, look at texts and say, what can I learn about the way that nature is being portrayed here, and how can that lesson help me to be more active, more of an activist, and more just and ethical in the ways in which I treat nature. Ecofeminism, like feminism, in which it partially has its roots, is really focused on activist and social change and work. And that's one of the things that kind of makes it really great. That's a really kind of bare bones explanation of what ecofeminism is. I hope that helped. Again, remember to check out Julia's presentation as well. All right, guys, I will see you next up for some Mama Day analysis.